Hello and welcome to No Worries Biology. My name is Anja Doyle, and with this video I'm inviting you to join me on an amazing field trip to a coral reef. Coral reefs are considered to be some of the Earth's most diverse ecosystems. That means they contain many different organisms. On this field trip, we are going to investigate what kind of animals live in coral reefs, how these animals are related to each other, and where these animals are located in the tree of life. When I'm using the term tree of life, I am talking about a model, a visual representation of evolutionary relationships between organisms. In this representation, groups of animals are located at the tips of branches, which all grow out of the same trunk. The closer the last common connection between two branches is, the closer those two groups of organisms located at these branches are related to each other, as this common connection represents a deceased ancestor that both groups had in common. So in this example, group B and C are more closely related to each other than group A and B or group A and C, because the last common connection between B and C is closer than the last common connection between A and B or A and C. Okay, in this video and on this virtual field trip, we are mainly going to fill this tree of life with groups of animals living in coral reefs. For more information on coral reefs in general or on the Great Barrier Reef in particular, its history and its current condition, I recommend that you watch No Worries Biology's videos Coral Reef Ecosystems and Introduction, or the Great Barrier Reef Past, Present and Future, which are soon going to be available as well. In this video, like I already said, we are focusing on animals living in coral reef ecosystems. Now that you've heard what the topic of this video is, you are probably imagining all kinds of colorful fish and turtles, of course. And yes, we are going to have a look at both of these groups. But first of all, I would like to talk about the group of animals which contains the organisms that are responsible for building coral reefs. So without them, Nemo and his friends wouldn't even have a reef to live in. Credit where credit is due. This group of animals has the scientific name Cnidaria, and we refer to them as Cnidarians in common English. The Greek word nidos means stinging nettle, and it was chosen because members of the phylum Cnidaria possess specialized cells that can sting, kind of like a stinging nettle. So, who belongs to the phylum Cnidaria? Today we know about 10,000 species of Cnidarians, and they are divided into the following groups. Firstly, there are hydras, small organisms that often possess a polyp shape. They mainly live in saltwater, but some can also be found in freshwater. Also in this group are jellies, aka jellyfish. You've probably heard of them. Jellies live in the ocean, and they also occur around coral reefs. And I'm guessing that most of you are familiar with this medusa stage of a jellyfish's life cycle. Great, moving on. Sea anemones and corals are two groups of animals that are closely related to each other, and together they are referred to as anthozoans. In their adult stage, anthozoans are almost always attached to the seabed, so they can't move around anymore. Let's have a look at sea anemones first. They were named after the terrestrial anemone plant because their tentacles look somewhat like the flower petals of a plant, I guess. Sea anemones use these tentacles for feeding and to defend themselves. They come in many different shapes and colors. Here we see a carpet anemone, for example, and here the Rittery or magnificent anemone. Sea anemones are very important for coral reef ecosystems because they provide shelter to a large variety of animals that can live nowhere else. However, they are still not the animals responsible for building reefs. For that, we need to look into corals. Yep, after all, these reefs are called coral reefs. Just like anemones, corals are sessile animals. That is the scientific term for describing that they can't move around because they are attached to the ground. An individual coral organism is a tiny little polyp, but usually they don't live alone, but in colonies of thousands, even millions of such polyps. Some corals, known as hard corals or stony corals, protect themselves by surrounding themselves with a hard substance called calcium carbonate. This calcium carbonate accumulates around the polyps and forms something like a protective armor or an outer skeleton. When they are not feeding, coral polyps pull their tentacles into the outer skeleton, and they only come out when they have to catch food. In many corals, that happens during the night. Like all organisms, individual coral polyps don't live forever. When they die, they decompose, but their calcium carbonate skeleton stays behind. And the next generation of polyps builds their own calcium carbonate skeletons right on top. And through this process, coral reefs form and grow and change because layer upon layer, tiny little polyps produce calcium carbonate skeletons to protect themselves. But as you can imagine, this process takes quite some time. Many decades, even centuries, have to pass for a substantial coral reef to be created. Scientists estimate that the Great Barrier Reef in the northeast of Australia, for example, is about 2 million years old. Not all coral polyps have the ability to form such protective, rigid outer skeletons, however. Some coral polyps, called soft corals, are surrounded and connected to each other by strong but flexible tissues. Because they are less rigid, they are more capable of withstanding the impact of strong waves, for example, but at the same time, they are not capable of building reefs. They live here, but they aren't capable of contributing to the reef's growth. One last fact about corals before we move on. Some species of hard corals, as well as soft corals, have developed a very special way of living. They host a certain kind of single-celled organism that lives within their polyp bodies. These organisms are called zooxanthellae. This living arrangement is beneficial for both of them, the coral polyp and the single-celled zooxanthellae, because the polyp with its stinging cells, remember we're in the phylum of Cnidarians, can provide protection to the zooxanthellae. And unlike the coral polyp, zooxanthellae can conduct photosynthesis, which means they can use sunlight to produce nutrients. And they share these nutrients with the coral polyp, kind of like paying rent for being allowed to live there and be protected. Such a mutually beneficial relationship is called a symbiosis. While Cnidarians are a very simple and ancient animal phylum, scientists believe this group to be more than 500 million years old. They are not the simplest group of animals known to us and present in coral reefs. Those are found in the phylum Porifera. The members of this group are commonly referred to as sponges. They too are sessile, attached to the ground, and they too show a wide variety of colors and shapes. They range in size from just a few millimeters to several meters. Most of the approximately 5,000 sponge species live in saltwater, and they are common inhabitants of coral reef. Being amongst the simplest of animals, sponges don't possess what we call true tissue, meaning cells of similar size and shape which act in unison. Rather, their cells, which are of similar or different types, act more or less independently from one another. Some of these cells produce fibers that stabilize the sponge's body. Others, for example, are responsible for filtering food out of the water. Sponges use the natural flow of water through their bodies as a means to having their food conveniently brought to them. So they just need to catch it when it drifts by. Animals using this way of gathering food are called suspension feeders. And this water streaming through their bodies also carries away their waste products. Quite a nice setup. As a side note, we know today that sponges produce a range of different antibiotics, which scientists are currently investigating. They are hoping to find new ways to treat certain human and animal diseases. And throughout human history, sponges have been used as tools for human body hygiene. Yes, that is why their common name sounds familiar to us. Softer sponges were used, for example, to soap up and rinse one's body, and harder varieties were used to fight calluses, etc. But the practice of using natural sponges for body hygiene is frowned upon by many people nowadays, as it contributes to the destruction of our reefs and other aquatic ecosystems. That being said, let's continue with our investigation into which groups of animals live in coral reefs. Yes, I know, I promised you colorful fish and turtles, but we're not quite there yet. So far, we have looked at porifera, or sponges, as the simplest of multicellular animals, which don't possess true tissue yet. And we have talked about cnidarians, hydras, jellies, sea anemones, and corals, some of which are responsible for slowly building up our reefs. Cnidarians differ from porifera amongst other facts in that they do possess true tissue, groups of similar cells that work together as a unit. Progressing in our tree of life, which visualizes how animals are related to each other, we find a phylum called platyhelminths, or flatworms, which is a direct translation of their Greek name into English. Flatworms got their names because they possess a thin, flat body, which features no inner body cavity or organs to circulate substances through their body, like our heart and circulatory system, for example. So they exchange all substances with their environment through their body's surface. They also have a central nervous system and simple sensory organs, so they can distinguish light from dark, for example, and they can react on that information. Tapeworms, who live as internal parasites in other animals and who can grow up to several meters long, are amongst the approximately 20,000 species in this group. And they may well be present at a coral reef in the digestive tract of some fish. But there are also free-living flatworms to be found in a coral reef, like this colorful species called Linda's flatworm or Pseudocerus lindae. Moving on, we encounter the phylum Annelida. This name means as much as small rings, because members of this group are worms whose bodies consist of segments which look somewhat like rings. Our common earthworm is probably the most well-known of the 16,500 annelid species, but earthworms don't live in coral reefs, of course. There are plenty of other annelids that do, however. Some feature a lot of hair-like bristles on their body, some only a few, like our earthworm. Unlike platyhelminths, annelids do possess an inner body cavity, a digestive tract running through their body, and a closed circulatory system. And just like platyhelminths, they have a central nervous system located on their belly. Scientifically, this side of their body is called ventral. Next, let's talk about a large group of animals that contains many well-known classes, the phylum Mollusca. Approximately 93,000 species of mollusks are known to us, roughly 2/3 of which live in the ocean or are marine. All mollusks have in common that their body is soft. With that in mind, and considering that the Latin word mollus translates as soft, flexible, or tender, we understand how they got their name. In most mollusks, this soft body is protected by a hard shell made of calcium carbonate. Yes, that's the substance we already encountered when we talked about hard corals. Chitons are perhaps the least well-known class of mollusks, so we will only have a quick look at them. They look somewhat like snails, but their back is protected by 8 rigid plates. Then we have the class of gastropods. This name means as much as belly foot, and it describes that animals which belong here have a muscular foot on their ventral side, which may be interpreted as their belly, on which they crawl. Snails and slugs belong into this group. Assuming that you are somewhat familiar with snails and slugs, this should give you an idea of what is meant with this belly foot. In snails, the hard shell which protects their soft body is easily visible. In slugs, however, this shell is greatly reduced and located inside their soft bodies. There are plenty of snails and slugs living in coral reefs. One particularly striking group of such sea slugs are nudibranchs, which wear their gills, branchs, uncovered or naked, nudi, on their back. Currently, about 3,000 species of nudibranchs are known to us, and amongst them they display a wide variety of magnificent shapes and colors. Furthermore, bivalves form a class of mollusks. Clams, mussels, oysters, and so on belong here. They are distinguished by possessing a shell which is divided into 2 halves, which can move against each other, so they can open and close. Here are 2 examples of clams that can be found in coral reefs. Firstly, the electric clam, Cnidarians alis. It got its name because it exhibits bright flashes of light which look like electric sparks. However, it doesn't really produce electric sparks, but it creates these flashes by reflecting the surrounding light in short bursts. Giant clams, Tridacna, are the largest bivalves on Earth. They can grow up to 1 meter or more in length, and they can weigh more than 200 kilograms. How do they achieve such an impressive size? Just like some of the polyps of soft and hard corals we talked about earlier, they live in symbiosis with single-celled organisms which are able to conduct photosynthesis. In exchange for the protection provided by the clam and its shell, the single-celled organisms supply the clam with extra nutrients, which in turn enables them to grow very large. And last but not least, we have the class of cephalopods as members of the phylum Mollusca. The name cephalopods can be translated as head feet, and it refers to the numerous tentacles, which resemble legs or feet somewhat, that are growing out of their heads. Octopuses, squids, and cuttlefish belong in this group. Cephalopods have large brains and well-developed sensory organs, their eyes, for example. Their nervous system is the most complex in all invertebrates, meaning in all animals without a vertebral column. They are widely believed to be amongst the most intelligent of all invertebrates. Moving along in our tree of life, we get to the next branch. All organisms that are located here have in common that they shed a tough outer layer when they grow. Amongst other phyla, we place Nematoda and Arthropoda here. Nematoda are roundworms that don't have a segmented body. Due to time constraints, we'll just leave it at that and move on to the Arthropoda. With more than 1 million described species, this phylum is incredibly diverse. More than 10 times as many species are found in the phylum Arthropoda as are known to us in the phylum Mollusca, for example, and more than 100 times as many species as in the phylum Cnidarians. And even though we haven't talked about vertebrates yet, it is also about 20 times more than all the fish, amphibia, reptile, bird, and mammal species combined. So arthropods form a very important and highly successful phylum. The name arthropod translates to feet with joints. And that is one of the characteristics members of this phylum have in common. They have legs that can be bent in specific places called joints. Some of these legs may have become modified in certain groups and may have taken on specific functions other than walking, like catching prey, physical defense, mating, or collecting sensory input. Furthermore, arthropods have a segmented body and a hard exoskeleton. That is that tough outer layer that they shed while growing that I just talked about a minute ago. It contains the polysaccharide chitin. And because it is tough and inflexible, they must replace it with bigger ones as they get larger. And this process is called molting. So who belongs to this diverse phylum called Arthropoda? First of all, there is a clade called chelicerates. Members of this clade have in common that their body can be divided into two major sections. The first of these sections is the cephalothorax, a fused unit of their head, cephalos, and their upper body, thorax. And the second part of their body is called the abdomen, their lower body. Chelicerates have simple eyes, they don't have antennae, and they have specialized legs at the very front of their body, which are claw-like, and they are used for feeding. These specialized appendages are called chelicerés. And you guessed it, the chelicerés are what chelicerates are named after. Many members of this clade live on land and breathe air. They are terrestrial. Spiders, harvestmen, scorpions, mites, and ticks belong to the chelicerates. But there are also a few marine chelicerates, for example, horseshoe crabs. Their name is misleading. They are not crabs, but chelicerates, more closely related to spiders than to crabs. Their jointed legs are located underneath their sturdy carapace, that hard shell you can see here. So the legs are invisible in this picture, but you can see them here. Horseshoe crabs are very interesting because this family is believed to be more than 400 million years old, and during this long period of time, they haven't changed much. And this is why they are sometimes referred to as living fossils. Another marine group in this circle of animals are sea spiders, some of which even live in coral reefs. It is currently under discussion whether they belong into the clade of chelicerates or if they might be a group of their own. There are many, many questions still waiting to be answered by future generations of biologists. Moving on. We find the clade of Myriapods within the phylum of Arthropods. The name Myriapods already implies that members of this group have a lot of legs. Centipedes, which translates to 100 feet, have one pair of legs on each body segment. And millipedes, their name meaning 1,000 feet, possess 2 pairs of legs on each body segment. Of course, millipedes don't really have 1,000 legs, but they certainly do have a lot of them. But all living myriapods are terrestrial, therefore they don't live in coral reefs, and We will therefore have to move on. The next group is called crustaceans. Approximately 40,000 species belong to this clade, which is characterized by 2 pairs of antennae and mandibles for chewing. Most, but not quite all, crustaceans are aquatic. They live in water, and there are numerous species living in and around coral reefs. Crabs, lobsters, and shrimp are maybe the first groups that come to mind when talking about crustaceans. But mantis shrimp, porcelain crabs, hermit crabs, barnacles, which are sessile, meaning only attached to a living or non-living surface when they are adults, and copepods, a group of very small animals, belong to the crustaceans as well. And even though copepods are very, very small, they nonetheless play an extremely important role in marine food chains because they are the most numerous multicellular organism on Earth. So what they might lack in size, they more than make up for in numbers. Moving on. Hexapods, better known as insects, are an extremely important group of arthropods. One of their common characteristics is that they have 6 legs. Pods. More species belong to the insect group than to all the other forms of life combined. Scientists believe that there might be more than 5 million insect species. Fewer scientists go even as far as suggesting that there might be up to 20 million insect species. But we currently know only 1 million. Insects can be found in almost any environment on land and in freshwater. However, they are almost completely absent from marine habitats, aka the ocean. So no insects living in coral reefs, and it's time for us to look at the next group of animals. We are now ready to climb back down from this particular branch in our tree of life, where the arthropods are located, and we enter another branch which will eventually bring us to the group of vertebrates. Remember those cute fishies and turtles I promised? However, we're still not quite there yet, but almost. First, we'll have a look at a phylum called Echinodermata. Their name means as much as spiky-skinned, so they're not exactly the cuddly types. Perhaps the group of echinoderms which makes this name most obvious is the class of Echinoidea, where we find sea urchins and sand dollars. They have a radially symmetrical body consisting of 5 equal parts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the way, this black sea urchin in this picture is lying upside down. So you can see its mouth in the middle of its body, which is usually located underneath and therefore not visible. Sea urchins eat algae, and for that reason they play an important role in keeping our coral reefs healthy, by keeping the amount of algae in check and ensuring that the algae doesn't overgrow and outcompete our corals. Holothuriidea, or sea cucumbers, might somewhat look like the vegetable they are named after, but they certainly are animals like all the organisms we talked about in this video. They are echinoderms that don't have spikes. Most sea cucumbers are scavengers or deposit feeders. They feed on dead and decaying organic matter. Here you can see a so-called pineapple cucumber sifting through the sand. And many sea cucumbers are capable of allowing the sand or other sediment to pass through their body while extracting the organic matter that they feed on from it, and then they just excrete the sand or other sediment. Some sea cucumbers have very impressive defensive techniques, but unfortunately that will have to wait till another time because we really need to move on. Asteroidea, where we find sea stars, are perhaps the most famous echinoderms. They also possess radial symmetry and consist of 5 equal parts. And unlike sea urchins, they have arms, usually 5, but some species have even more than that. Each of the 5 segments and arms contains an equal share of the animal's organs. And this is why sea stars can recover when they are losing an arm, like this necklace starfish here. And last but not least, Crinoidea, where we find feather stars, for example, belong to the echinoderms as well. They use their feather-like arms to filter particles out of the water and feed on them. And just like the other echinoderms, they can be found abundantly in coral reefs. Looking back, I have to say that we have covered quite a bit of ground already. Therefore, without further ado, let's look into our last phylum, chordates, scientifically called chordata. Chordates have a spinal nerve cord which in vertebrates like us develops into the spinal cord and brain. But let's first have a quick glimpse into a less complex clade of chordates, the tunicates. In coral reefs, they are represented by animals like this golden sea squirt, for example. By drawing water through their body, tunicates feed on particles they filter out of the water. So even though they might look a bit like sponges, which we talked about in the beginning of this video, they are actually quite different. While sponges need to rely on the natural flow of water, tunicates have the ability to actively create that flow of water through their bodies themselves. That is what I call independence. But I know, not necessarily everybody is as excited about sea squirts as I am. Therefore, let's finally talk about vertebrates. Like I already said before, vertebrates have a dorsal nerve cord which develops into their spinal cord and brain. Dorsal means that this nerve cord is located close to their back. The spinal cord is surrounded and protected by vertebrae, from which we derive the name vertebrates for this group. And the brain is enclosed in a protective skull. Roughly 70,000 species of vertebrates are currently known to us, and traditionally they are divided into 5 groups: fish, amphibia, reptiles, birds, and mammals. But this first group that we refer to as fish really consists of mainly 2 separate classes: cartilaginous fishes, scientifically called chondrichthyes, and ray-finned bony fishes, Actinopteridae. These names already indicate to us what the differences between these 2 classes of fishes are. While members of the second group have rays inside their fins and a skeleton made out of bone, the first group has no such rays and a skeleton made out of cartilage. That is the substance that the tip of our noses and our ears are made of, for example. Sharks and rays are the most well-known members of the chondrichthyes, cartilaginous fishes. For them, having a skeleton made out of cartilage is an advantage because cartilage is lighter than bone. And as they don't have a swim bladder to make them buoyant in the water, this saves them quite a bit of energy when moving around. There are about 1,000 species of cartilaginous fishes, and some of these are frequent and very important members of coral reef biocenosis, like this white-tip reef shark or this blue-spotted ribbon-tail ray. Ray-finned fishes, Actinopteridae, are, however, far more numerous and diverse. We currently know roughly 30,000 species. As you already learned, they possess a skeleton made out of true bone and rays within their fins. Most of them also possess a swim bladder to regulate their buoyancy. And when you visit a coral reef, ray-finned fishes are absolutely everywhere. Some are larger, some smaller, some are relatively round in shape, like these spadefish. Some are very long and thin, like these barracudas. Some fish are relatively hard to spot because they camouflage to either hide from their predators or to surprise their prey, like this scorpionfish here. Some fish are very colorful and flamboyant, like anemone fish, angelfish, butterfly fish, and so on. And depending on their specific way of living and survival strategy, some fish don't even look all that much like the stereotypical image of a fish we have in our heads. These frogfish, for example, look quite unusual. The body of moray eels is perfectly adapted for them to hide in crevices and little holes and to ambush their prey as it swims by. Similarly, ribbon eels and garden eels look almost more like snakes than like fish. The same goes for the pipefish. And the closely related seahorses have a very unique shape all of their own. Some fish are so well camouflaged that it's hard to recognize them as animals at all, like these razorfish mimicking leaves floating in the water, or this ornate ghost pipefish. Okay, that's enough about fish for the moment. The next class of vertebrates is formed by the amphibians. Together with reptiles, birds, and mammals, they form the group Tetrapoda. Members of this group have 4 limbs in the shape of legs or wings or arms or flippers. So all classes we are going to talk about from now on belong in this superclass Tetrapoda. Amphibians, the class we're talking about right now, rely on fresh water for their reproduction. For this reason, there are no true marine amphibian species, and that means no amphibians in coral reefs. So it's time for us to move on to the next class, reptiles. When we use the group name reptiles, we refer to turtles, snakes, lizards, and crocodilians. These 4 groups of tetrapods have in common that they have tough, dry skin, which is covered and protected by horny scales or scutes. However, some reptiles, namely crocodilians, are actually more closely related to birds than to the other reptile groups. That being said, all 4 groups of reptiles have at least some marine members. There is exactly 1 marine lizard, the Galapagos iguana, and in the crocodilian group, we have the saltwater crocodile, Crocodylus porosus. With males growing up to 6 meters long, it is one of the largest crocodilians living today. They use ocean currents to swim long distances, so they might every now and then occur in a coral reef, but they don't live here permanently. Then there are between 60 and 70 species of sea snakes. They are venomous snakes that spend pretty much their entire life in the ocean. While they don't exist in the Atlantic Ocean, they can be found in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, where they inhabit shallow waters, like those around coral reefs. And last but not least, turtles. There are 7 marine turtle species, among them the hawksbill sea turtle. The shell or carapace of sea turtles is flatter and more streamlined than that of terrestrial tortoises. This shell provides very reliable protection against predators, and in some comics and animations you sometimes see a turtle taking off its shell to, wash and dry it. But they can't actually do that because the shell is fused to their vertebrae. Even though turtles spend some time in the open ocean, most of their life they spend living around coral reefs. And just like all the other marine reptilians, they don't have gills but lungs. So they frequently need to swim to the surface to breathe air. Great, let's say goodbye to this hawksbill sea turtle now. And let's talk about birds. Approximately 10,000 species of birds living today are known to us. They are a class of vertebrates and tetrapods that is characterized by possessing feathers and wings as their forelimbs, among other traits. While there aren't any birds permanently living in coral reefs, they nevertheless influence coral reefs in important ways. Some birds feed on fish living in coral reefs, keeping their population in check. They dive into the water to catch their prey, and then they come back up to the surface and eat their food. And bird droppings bring nutrients back into the ocean water. So you could say that birds are kind of fertilizing the ocean. Now we have just one more class of animals left to discuss, and that is the class of mammals, where we as humans belong, as well as approximately 5,500 other species. Mammals are characterized by having hair or fur covering their skin, giving birth to living offspring, and feeding this offspring for a while with milk produced by the mother. For that reason, mammals possess lips so that the young can suckle the mother's milk. Humans are without doubt the mammals with the biggest impact on coral reefs, and this impact is detrimental. We damage the physical structure of reefs with inconsiderate boating, fishing, and building practices. We decimate, disturb, and unbalance the biocenosis of coral reefs with unsustainable fishing operations. We pollute coastal waters with sewage and agricultural runoff, disturbing the water chemistry. And by emitting large quantities of greenhouse gases, we contribute to global warming. And rising air, and in particular, rising water temperatures, threaten the symbiosis between coral polyps and zooxanthellae, which in turn threatens the existence of coral reefs in general. So, in a nutshell, we are the biggest enemy of coral reefs. But what about the other mammals? There are a few marine mammals that can occasionally be found on the outskirts of coral reefs. Among them are dugongs and manatees. Both genera are large herbivores that feed on seagrasses. Dolphins can be seen swimming by coral reefs occasionally, yes. And while most seals live in cold water and therefore can't be found around coral reefs, the monk seal lives in the tropical water of the Caribbean and around Hawaii, and so every now and then it visits the coral reef. All right, now we have discussed the entire animal kingdom, and we have investigated which groups of animals occur in coral reefs and how these groups are related to each other. And we have discussed a huge pool of information. And it might take a while to let all of this information sink in. But in any case, I think we saw and we learned that the animal world around coral reefs is incredibly diverse and absolutely fascinating. I hope this video has provided you with some new information and also with some entertainment and joy. No Worries Biology offers an ever-growing pool of materials for biology lessons and language support. Just have a look around at www.noworriesbiology.com and see you next time.